Father in heaven, we thank you so much for this opportunity to go through a series on this very important topic of true education. We know that this is close to your heart. We know that you are a teacher and that we are all called to be teachers as well. And so as we think about the history of your movement, we just pray for insight and wisdom to discern the times in which we live. And we just pray that your words would come through, that our opinions and preconceived notions and a speaker's thoughts would all be set aside and surrendered unto your Spirit. In Jesus' name, amen. We live in the 21st century. The high-tech, super information age has revolutionized everything, including schooling. Education today is undergoing dramatic changes, and educational thinkers and secular theorists are looking at the way we do school and asking some very tough questions that are really pushing and stretching the way we've always viewed school for the past 100+ years. For example, community colleges, some of them are making some pretty revolutionary changes actually to just reverse and do school kind of backwards. What I mean by that is what you usually have in class, you have the lecture and then kids go and do their homework. Well, they're doing that flipped now. They have, for homework, you watch a lecture on your computer that you've downloaded from the internet, a top lecturer who does it really well, and he presents the best information. So you get the expert there, and then the teacher's job is to work with the students in the classroom. So it's just one example, one way that the school's being changed by the information age. And as I think about how we've done school for the past 100 years, it never really did make that much sense, and especially in the information age. There is so much change, so much possibility to do education and school differently. Now, I'm not going to get deeply into that in this session. I'm actually working on a Schooled 2, where we're going to talk about how more of this issue about how school as we know it is dead and dying, and these new ways of viewing education are really starting to flourish. But even secular educational thinkers, just like I point out in the series called Schooled, they're starting to say things like, it looks as if the way that we designed school 100+ years ago was deliberately designed to make it so that it didn't coordinate well with how students learn. I've heard this again and again. Industrial age schooling, they say, factory schooling model is not how kids learn. It's not serving the mind. It's not serving the needs of the human being in terms of how they learn. If secular thinkers are able to say that, then certainly we can look at our blueprint, our wonderful stack of books here that I referred to again and again last time. If you haven't had a chance to go through those, absolutely these are wonderful, wonderful books. The book Education should be read by every Christian. This one right here sums up a lot of it very well. But nonetheless, when they say things like, it looks like schooling was designed to not help children learn, I'm going, I know there's something more nefarious going on. And we looked at that in the series called Schooled. You might remember Horace Mann visiting Prussia, bringing Prussian-style schooling back to America in 1844. I want to review some of that history, but also insert what else was going on in God's educational movement. In Schooled, we looked at the history of worldly schooling and how we got what we got. But I want to see how God's answer to modern schooling has been coming through all along. 1844, of course, is an important date. And you know that that is the date where the Advent movement was at its height, launching into this last days people who have the message of the judgment has come, Babylon is fallen, receive not the mark of the beast, and so on. The three angels' message, the truth of the Sabbath, the truth of the character of God, the truth of the sanctuary, the truth of Christ's soon coming, the spirit of prophecy, the 10 commandments, everything that we have as a blessing from God began at this same time, including a message on how to do true education. Now that didn't start in 1844. When did that come in? Well, the year was 1872, when Ellen G. White wrote her first testimony on education. Well, you know what else was going on in 1872? It was the Circular of Information. This was quoted in Schooled, where the U.S. government stated that inculcating knowledge enables the masses to be able to, quote, perceive and calculate their grievances, and such an enabling is bound to retard the growth of industry. Now, if you're wanting some context for that, some further elaboration on that, again, view Schooled. This series called Undoctrinated is the sequel to Schooled. You have to view that, but basically the idea is a bunch of industrialists wanted to have a monopoly on the business of education so that they could inculcate the masses with a system of indoctrination, a system of compliance training, so they would be good, obedient, compliant workers in their factories. Which is the same model that the Prussians did to establish their industry and to establish their military forces, to have obedient, well-drilled soldiers. And that came to America. 1872. While you had these statements coming out, you also had the movement of true education starting. Now, you're going to see these histories run parallel. It wasn't just 1844, 1872. In the 1890s, this was the decade when the worldly compulsory schooling systems were coming in. Every state in America had a compulsory schooling law in place by the 1890s, all except one, which came in 15 years after that. But compulsory Prussian-style schooling was really on the march in the 1890s. You know what else was going on in the 1890s? This man on the screen, very important individual. His name is E.A. Sutherland, and in the 1890s, he was the president of Battle Creek College and led a revival in Battle Creek, which led to the formation of church schools all across America. Let me explain. There were students at the Battle Creek College under his leadership. He was a spiritual leader, not just an educational thinker, not just somebody who was into the business of how to run a good school, an administrator. No, he was a spiritual man. Revival and Reformation came to the students, and they came asking, what shall we do? With this enthusiasm, with this mission call, they were reading the same things I shared with you from the book Education in the last session about how the presence of that same guide in educational work will do the same thing in the last days that it did in Jesus' time, and that is the gospel to the world in a generation because of true education. So there were all these enthusiastic students, many of them in teacher training programs and going into teacher training programs because they wanted to be the teachers of the church schools all across America. 1890s, the church schools of the Seventh-day Adventist Church began to be formed and founded because of this revival that came out of Battle Creek. And not just that, but the purpose of these Christian schools, these Seventh-day Adventist church schools, is to train that army of youth. So the 1890s, the very same time when Prussian schooling was really making its march, consolidating, getting all the states on board with compulsory schooling laws, meaning you must send your kid to school. It's the law. That in the 1890s also was being competed with by God's movement of true education. Now, by the way, just a quick note on Sutherland, amazing individual. He was also head of Walla Walla College at around this time in his day. And something absolutely noteworthy that he did, and I think we can all take this as our example, whether we're teachers or parents or whatever. He would convene the teachers a week before the school started, and they would spend their time going through these councils, reading through them, discussing them for a whole week, and asking themselves, how can we better form and reform our school to be more along the lines of what God has required of us? I think that's a great idea that we all should be doing in our own lives. How can God reform me? Maybe you're not in the educational work and you're not a parent. If you're a parent, definitely you need to be reading through child guidance, reading through Adventist Home. I hope you're viewing the seminar called Raising the Remnant as well. But again, in this history, you got E.A. Sutherland coming in with this Reformation, but also at the same time, 1890s, the schools were becoming Prussianized. And as a part of that, the Prussian model was fix students rigidly in grades according to age group, age segregation, if you will. Have them, the bells ring, they move from class to class in large crowds, they sit in rows. It's, very factory style. It's not like Jesus' education where he learned from the daily experiences of life and nature and from the Bible and from daily work. This was the Prussian style schooling was moving forward, and the grades element I want to focus on a second, because the idea was 7-year-olds go to school with 7-year-olds. 9-year-olds are in class with 9-year-olds. 13-year-olds with 13-year-olds. And you segregate it out, there was a voice of protest. Mrs. E.G. White. The system of grading is a hindrance to the pupil's real progress. Some pupils are slow at first, and the teacher needs to exercise great patience. But these pupils may, after a short time, learn so rapidly as to astonish him. Others may appear to be very brilliant, but time may show that they have blossomed too suddenly. The system of confining children rigidly to grades is not wise. In conversation, A.T. Jones responds, the sooner grades are done away with so that the teacher can get close to the children, the better. Did you notice what A.T. Jones just said? So the teacher can get close to the children. This is a family-style school. Our schools should be as home-like as possible. We want age integration. We want smaller groups, like Jesus had 12, and that's the motive here. But then Mrs. White responds with, I know that some better system can be found just as soon as our instructors learn the true principles of education. So over 100 years ago, these are just progressive thinkers, and I mean that in the good sense of the word. They're reformers. They're educational theorists saying, you know what, this Prussian thing, they didn't use the word Prussian, but we want to do away with grades as soon as possible, as soon as we can learn the principles of true education. So while Prussian schooling is bringing kids rigidly into grades, you know what they're also doing is getting school to start earlier and earlier. And putting kids in school at even as early as 8, 7, 6, even 5-year-old children, which to us sounds normal, but that is not historically normal at all. That's a very early age to be starting school. So let's listen to the prophetic voice on that. Here, little children have to spend from 3 to 5 hours a day breathing air that is laden with impurity and perhaps infected with the germs of disease. No wonder that in the schoolroom the foundation of lifelong illness is often laid. Many parents have kept their children at school nearly the year round. The monotony of continual study wearies the mind. So the Prussian model, bringing kids into school very early, having not entirely year-round schooling, but nearly the year-round with a summer vacation. I think that it was 42 weeks was in Prussia, how many weeks of school the children had per year. And so nearly the year-round, very early ages, and for 3 to 5 hours per day. Which, again, that kind of makes me laugh. I'm like, that's a half day. When I was a teacher, if we had a 3 or a 5 hour school, they're like, yeah, we're getting out early today. But she's talking about little children being in school from 3 to 5 hours a day is not good for them. So you're seeing how these histories run parallel. 1844, 1872, 1890s, the different Prussian features going back and forth, and the Adventist movement starting with the church schools, and then the early formal education being confronted by the prophetic voice, and the system of grading being confronted by the prophetic voice. So the question is, which one will prevail? Worldly schooling, God's true education. And this is a very important question. This is like an epic narrative of battle between these two forces. It's important because of all institutions in our world, the school is the most important. Wow, that's quite a statement. Because school will either, as the subtitle of Schooled says, school will either deliberately dumb down, reduce intelligence, re-engineer society, and destroy individuality, or true education, as the subtitle of this seminar says, home education in the schools of the prophets will produce the last generation. It'll be a means of redemption. It'll be a means of training the last gospel workers. It'll be a means of harmoniously developing the physical, the mental, and the spiritual. These are two ways of forming little children's minds and souls, either for service to the enemy or to God. That's, by the way, why I believe I have my personal laptop where I do all of my seminar preparations, all of my study and work on. In a 3-week time, I had 3 separate laptop hard drives crash in 3 weeks. I believe there is a great controversy going on. I believe in angels and demon forces, that these are actual entities involved in this world. I believe this is a very important seminar. It was right when I was working on Undoctrinated that we had 3. I've never had a hard drive crash in my entire life. I'm age 34. All of a sudden, 3 hard drive crashes in 3 weeks. Because of all the institutions in our world, the school is the most important. Let's continue on. Consolidation of Prussian schools takes place throughout the early part of the 20th century. You've got in the 1920s, 30s, 40s, the high schools becoming bigger. You've got school districts forming and growing. You've got more and more and more of the students being brought into the dragnet of compulsory schooling. You've got the public schools becoming more and more secularized, evolution coming in and being taught. In the 1960s, starting to remove reference to religious matters, which are a part of the fabric of history. Not that we should be forcing religion in the public sector, understand that, but the schools are becoming more and more of the world. And by the 1970s, God's methods of true education from the Garden of Eden, the homeschool method, that is almost extinct in American society. I'm coming at this from American history. I was an American history teacher. In the 1970s, the statistics show us, the history tells us that there were less than 10,000 homeschoolers left in America. Less than 10,000 in a country of hundreds of millions, and you're looking at only a few thousand kids still being educated in their homes. So in other words, the Prussian schooling was winning, and it looked like checkmate, it's gonna win. Homeschooling was illegal in most states. People kind of assumed that the way we're doing school right now in the 1970s is just the way you do life. This is, there's kind of a historical illiteracy. They viewed this as the norm when really, historically, the concept of children being raised full-time in a state institution called the public school, this was a brand new, quite radical experiment in history, but it became viewed as normal. And if you were homeschooling, you're really kind of weird and even criminal in some places. And it was just this aberrant thing of like, nobody really knew a homeschool family. It was very different than today. I mean, homeschooling is mainstream, we'll talk about that. But back in the 1970s, that was the battle that had happened, and it looked like Prussian education was going to win. Christian schools were struggling to find their true identity in true education. They were starting to develop, but they were kind of modeling themselves after the schools of the world. So what happens in a society like this? Well, you know about the 60s and 70s in cultural history. The 60s and 70s were a time of the countercultural revolution. This was the time where drug use and sexual perversion and immorality was just on the march, and the family was falling apart, and divorce rates were rising, and all of these horrible statistics are coming out, and you're going, what's happening to our culture? Why is it happening? The greatest suffering has come upon the human family because parents have departed from the divine plan. And that statement is even more true in the 60s and 70s than when it was originally said. When our schools become worldly, when public schools dominate in their worldview of postmodernism and there is no morals and all of this is pushed forward, the culture suffers big time when the family is failing. But the Lord didn't stop. I'm glad the story doesn't end there. That would be sad. Like, well, now we're going to end our session, and that's, the sad end of true education. No way, because we know how the end of the story goes. You've read the Bible. Christ returns. We have the gospel message go forth. And the reformatory movement made a comeback, starting in the early 80s, okay? And I'm going to put a face up on the screen here. This is Dr. Raymond Moore. Very, very important individual. He and his wife, Dorothy, were the founders of the modern homeschool movement. Now, you may have never heard of Dr. Raymond Moore. I hope you have, because he's one of the single most important individuals in cultural history. As a historian, I look at different cultural movements and what happens throughout history and the ebb and flow of movements. One of the most important cultural shifts has taken place in my lifetime. I was born in 1980, and that's exactly when the homeschool movement started here. But the homeschool movement is one of the most important ever in terms of cultural history in America. It has really shaken the school system to its foundation. But let me tell you the story of how this happened. He was a Seventh-day Adventist Christian, Dr. Raymond Moore, the late Dr. Raymond Moore. And as a Seventh-day Adventist Christian, I would say he was probably the second most influential Seventh-day Adventist in history in terms of impacting the broader culture. And I'm not talking about our pioneers. I'm Ellen G. White, obviously, writing all of that. That's in a separate category. But as individuals who influence the broader culture as known names out there, John Harvey Kellogg, who eventually went apostate, unfortunately, and Dr. Raymond Moore, I put him right next to John Harvey Kellogg and the influence that he had, because he's the founder of the modern homeschooling movement. Now, don't take my word for that. That's Joseph Murphy's book, Homeschooling in America. Moore became the most visible and the most celebrated homeschool leader in the nation. And so, very important individual, even recognized by historians, secular commentators on homeschooling. In the 1970s, he advocated and sort of made his name when he was pushing for delaying formal education. And, 8 to 10, wait to put the kids in an academic setting until they're a little older, he was saying. He got into Harper's Magazine and Reader's Digest and really made a big splash as a critic of public education, as a critic of early formal education. But he hadn't yet founded the homeschool movement yet in the 70s. It was when he got onto the Focus on the Family radio program with Dr. James Dobson in 1979. And this was, if you will, if you want a historical signpost here, a historical anchor point, this is the point where you can say the homeschool movement really was instituted, the modern homeschool. This is kind of how human beings lived throughout history, just with their families in their communities. But in the 1970s, it didn't exist hardly. In America, the modern homeschooling movement explodes after 1979 because he gets on Dr. Dobson's program. He promotes this idea of, hey, let's not just keep our kids at home till 8 or 10. Let's just keep them at home. I've got a crazy radical idea, parents. Let's raise our kids. It's not really that radical. Of course, historically speaking, that's the norm. But he promotes this on there. At first, Dobson's leery about it. He's kind of battling on it, but then he gets on board, and he promotes it. And in the 1980s, this is amazing, the statistics, okay? We go from a few thousand homeschool kids in the 70s to, by just 6 years later, 1985, after he's on the program in 1979, 6 years later, there are 50,000 homeschoolers in America. By 10 years after that, 1995, 500,000 homeschoolers in America. 5 years after that, the year 2000, 1 million homeschoolers. So in 20 years, from 1980 to 2000, you've got going from almost none to now 1 million. That's a major, major cultural shift, a major movement in society. And by the way, you might wonder, well, how much today? The statistics vary depending on who you ask, but in the last 15 years, they say that we've added at least another 1 million. I would estimate closer to 2 million. People are fleeing the public schools in droves. And you might say, why? What? Well, partly they're learning some of the things that I present in school. They're seeing how the agenda to indoctrinate the children is so forcefully advancing, but also partly because the information age is killing industrial age schooling. Parents who once felt a little insecure about academically helping their children grow and educating their children, well, now they have a lot of resources online. They form networks online. They can gain access to things and help that they couldn't have in the past. And so they're feeling a little bit more comfortable saying, I think we can do this. And it's absolutely exploding. Here's a graph showing the growth of homeschooling, 1999, 4-year increments there, just leaping up, bounding year after year, the number of homeschool students, starting 850,000, then up over 1 million, and then 2011 cruising toward 2 million homeschoolers in America. Well, what are the results of this? Is this working? You might say, well, our average parents, they're not trained educators. They don't have a degree in this. Is this going to help the kids learn academically? And wouldn't they be better off going and learning from a professional teacher? Well, the first generation of the homeschool movement is finally graduating, moving on into adulthood, and we're getting some data and some information about the success of their lives and of their academic careers and so on. And I should say, first and foremost, most importantly, the data is showing us, aside from academics are important, but the most important thing has to do with character, right? And what they're finding in the research is that homeschool students are more civically minded, doing more community service. They're more interested in others, in other words. Also, they internalize, this is the most important finding in the entire research, the entire body of research on the homeschool movement. Homeschool students internalize the values of their parents at very high rates, much higher than most. That's what we're going for, right? That's why God created this system in Eden. This isn't Dr. Raymond Moore, James Dobson, or anybody's idea. Moore got it from Ellen G. White, who got it from God. This is the Lord Jesus Christ who's given us this idea. So here's a statistic, though, on academics. Right here you can see the blue bars and the red bars. The red bars are the average student in America in the public school system, okay? So in total reading, the average student is obviously at the 50th percentile. Total language, 50th percentile. The percentile means that they outperform half of their peers in that category. Now, when you look at the blue bars, that would be homeschool students, okay? Take a look at how much homeschool students outperform the 89th percentile in total reading. So that means the average homeschooler has a better reading ability on a standardized test than 89% of the country. And 84%, the average homeschool student is 84% in total, the 84th percentile in total language, 84th percentile in total math, 86th percentile in science, 84th percentile in social studies. So across the board, in every academic category, they're absolutely, succeeding understates it. I have to come up with a better word of, they're just blowing it out of the water. They're just absolutely shocking the observers who were going, really? That's just parents at home educating their children? And they can become this good academically? This is quite a revolution in the educational world to be looking at this. They score better on standardized tests. By the way, interestingly, regardless of whether the parents had academic degrees in teaching or the level of the parents' formal education, it doesn't matter. They're all scoring up in this top percentile range. Doesn't matter whether the parents have teaching certificates or anything like that. It's just the fact that they were educated at home. Now, I should give you a quick disclaimer on that. There are exceptions, of course. I know a family that are homeschooling their son, and he sits at home and plays video games all day. Okay, so he's not going to, there's no magic about taking your kids out of the public school, and then all of a sudden, we can just stare at a blank white wall all day, and we'll be brilliant. No. It's what these parents are doing successfully that is producing these numbers. And we're going to talk about that in sessions 2, 3, and 4 of Undoctrinated. We're going to see what the blueprint is. But interestingly, these are by and large not Seventh-day Adventist home. This is an evangelical movement broadly in the conservative Christian religious right sector of society, demographic of society. These guys don't have and read, to a great extent, the blueprint that we've been given. And even without that, they're doing that much better academically and character and everything. So it is truly amazing to see how, when God said in Eden and thereafter with the patriarchs, that the model is parents ought to raise their children. That this is producing results. Baylor University did a study where they looked at the students' propensities to get a 4.0 GPA. That means straight A's across the board. And they found that homeschoolers were 4 times more likely to get a 4.0 GPA than non-homeschooled students. Here's a little graph on some different universities that I've looked at. The homeschool graduates' GPAs versus non-homeschool graduates. You can see they're significantly higher at every university. Homeschoolers doing better in college. A friend of mine, Joshua White, actually the speaker on the Classroom of the Remnant, and I keep mentioning Classroom of the Remnant during this Undoctrinated series. I really think this is kind of a companion series to Undoctrinated, because I'm talking about true education here in 4 sessions. My friend Joshua White also talks about true education. We share a passion for that. He and I are friends. We live in the same town. We're always talking about education and child development and these things. He's dealing mostly with early childhood development. But personally, he was homeschooled, my friend Joshua. And his mom kind of egged him on once to tell me his ACT score, because I was a little skeptical, learning, open-minded, but I was a teacher, and I kind of had a certain viewpoint on how to reach academic success, and I had asked him, how much time did you spend on academics, and what kind of things did you do academically? And I'm probing all the homeschoolers I'm talking to now, the teenagers, the young adults, and his mom said, tell him what you got on the ACT. He's like, I don't want to do that, She says, come on, tell him. And now I'm telling the world. He didn't even want to tell. But I got to, because people got to learn, this thing works. Now you might not know what ACT scores are. He got a 31 on his ACT, which is really good. That's like scholarships level, colleges recruiting you kind of stuff. And it blows mine out of the water, I'll just say that. And I was a ne'er-do-well when I was a teenager, but you know, I had the ability to score well enough to get an honors scholarship too, to college, but far below Joshua's 31. Interestingly, also, I asked him, well, then you must have been cramming for this. Like, did you spend, you know, all day on academics your whole childhood? No. I spent an hour to 3 hours a day on academics. An hour to 3 hours? How did you pull off that? Well, he says, well, we believed in equalizing the mental and the manual, and we're going to learn about that in sessions 3 and 4 of Undoctrinated. They didn't come up with this idea, his family, but anyway, it works. God's way works. So listen to sessions 3 and 4 and go, oh, that really can produce academic success. Homeschooling really can produce academic success. And we're going to talk about Adventist schools too in this session because they're producing success as well. But one more quick story on my friend Joshua. This is just a fun story to tell. He went to a class in college and started, you know, voicing his thoughts in discussions, and the professor learned that he was a, you know, homeschooled Christian, and she starts kind of targeting him because she's a secular leftist professor, and she's you know, really, you know, making fun of him and using him as an example and bringing him out, and you know, this is what's wrong with society kind of stuff. And well, he promoted the idea in a class discussion that he wanted to write his paper on delayed formal education, which is you know, waiting till 8 or 10 to put your kids in an academic setting, whether in the home or a school of the prophets. And she was just absolutely railing on him. Oh no, yeah, this is ridiculous homeschool propaganda nonsense and conservative Christian, you know, she's giving him a really hard time for it. Well, she gives him permission to write the paper on that. He writes a paper on, which I read, by the way, which led me to say, Joshua, can you do a series on early childhood development for Belt of Truth Ministries? I want something called the Classroom of the Remnant because he's got it. So I read his paper, and it was a fantastic paper, but he submitted it to the professor. And when he submitted it to the professor, he was bracing himself. He's going, all right, she's going to really tear this thing apart, I'm sure. Well, she's reading through it. No red marks on the paper. She gets to the end of it, and she says, I was highly skeptical of your point of view, as you know, but I am awarding this paper the first 100% paper, A, straight A, because it's well documented, the research is valid, and you've totally changed my point of view on delayed formal education. Isn't that cool? So anyway, I'm just bragging on my friend Joshua because homeschooling works. It's not just him. It's the research. It's the data. I like the anecdotal stories because they're kind of fun. But nonetheless, you've seen it in your personal experience. I've seen it in the students that I come across. I travel around. I speak for a living. This, you know, I used to be a teacher. This is what I do now. I'm at a different church pretty much every weekend, most of the year, much of the year. And as I'm coming in touch with families, and I see a couple of students walking toward me to shake my hand after the sermon, or we're sitting down at a meal at lunch, I've been able to discern which kids are homeschooled and which aren't. And I can actually guess, not because of any inherent intelligence or insight on my part, but because they are different and they stand out. And so I started a little game with myself. I started seeing if I could guess, and I would actually say it out loud and put myself out on a limb there. And I started doing it. I said, are you homeschooled by any chance? And the kid would look at me and be like, yeah, how did you know? Well, you're just different. In a good way. Socialization skills are higher. Able to interact with adults at a better level, well-behaved, well-mannered, eye contact, all of these positive good things, the family's actually together. That's sometimes a cue for me. And so my score right now, I'm actually keeping score. I'm 36 out of 37. So I've gotten one wrong, a really, really well-raised kid, happened to be in school. But 36 times I've said, are you homeschooled? And they're like, yeah, I am. How did you know? Because they really just are different. So the research is in, the anecdotes are in, but a quick disclaimer, and I said it already, I want to say it again. I don't want everybody just to get fired up about there's some magical potion here with not having my kid in a school. you've got to follow the blueprint. So watch sessions 3 and 4 and make sure that you're doing something positive in replacement of public schooling, okay? Now, if you're viewing this going, why would this matter to me? I'm not homeschooling my children. I've got my kids in a school, and I like our school. Enough on the homeschooling thing. But wait a minute. Every Seventh-day Adventist Christian family, if you're following this program, you are a homeschool family. Because you're keeping your kid at home till 8 or 10, and then you've got all those other periods of time that I mentioned, after school, weekends, breaks, and summer vacation. Every faithful view yourself as the primary educator in all matters of your child. Spiritual, mental, moral. If you need the help of a school, that's fine and great, and that's part of God's plan and program. You don't need to feel bad about that. Spirit of Prophecy says all of our children should have the privilege of one of these schools of the prophets. But you're still the primary educator of your child, parent. Don't forget that, okay? Now, you'll notice also I said earlier that you'll be educating your small child at home till 8 or 10, and this begs the question, what is school age? I've mentioned 8 or 10. I'm just going to plug again, Classroom of the Remnant, because Joshua gets into this in great depth on the research on why we delay formal education. Here's a statement from Spirit of Prophecy on that. The only schoolroom for children until 8 or 10 years of age should be in the open air amid the opening flowers and nature's beautiful scenery. So the only schoolroom until 8 or 10. Parents should be the only teachers of their children until they have reached 8 or 10 years of age. Now I'm going to get into this more too in Raising the Remnant as well. But that also kind of begs the question, some people have asked me, they've been kind of critical of our schools, and they say, Seventh-day Adventist schools don't follow the counsel on the 8 or 10 message because they're letting students come into the school when they're 7. That's wrong. Well, I want to take us back in some of the history. There's a reason why, and it's appropriate for schools to open their doors to children before 8 or 10. And this is part of this history because we got fired up in the 1890s about the church school, right? We're going to follow the blueprint. And these schools were closing their doors to children under 10. They played it safe. They said age 10 only may apply. Well, what this led to was, in Ellen White's own town in California, Seventh-day Adventists were starting to get a bad name because there were a lot of families who didn't understand how to truly discipline their children. And instead of putting them in the school, the kids would just be running around in the streets and just running amok, doing their own thing. And that was the problem because they were misbehaving, they were learning bad habits, they were associating with bad peers. And so they came to Ellen White with this question, and they said, what do we do? And she said, mothers should be able to instruct their little ones wisely during their early years of childhood. If every mother were capable of doing this and would take time to teach her children the lessons they should learn in early life, she's talking about till age 8 or 10, then all children could be kept in the home school until they are 8 or 9 or 10 years old. In many homes, there is but little discipline, and the children are allowed to do as they please. Those who are unable to train their children aright should never have assumed the responsibilities of parents. They should never have become parents. But because of their mistaken judgment, they had kids and they shouldn't have. Shall we make no efforts to help their little ones to form right characters? Therefore, I, from the light that God has given me, declare that if there is a family that has not the capabilities of educating their young children, nor the discipline and government over their young children, requiring obedience, that the very best thing is to put them in some place where they will be required to obey. So notice this isn't to get them a head start on learning. Yes, we're going to throw away the don't do academics till 8 or 10 thing. No. We're not throwing that away. We're just putting them before they're 8 or 10 in a place where they will learn to obey. This is to learn discipline. This is to give them order and structure in their lives, not to start academics earlier. So let's read on about how to do this. Here is a work that must be done for the families and for the children that are as old as 7 years and 8 years and 9 years. These are the ones who were barred from the school previously. She says, here's what we can do. We can do the same as they have in Battle Creek. They took me, meaning when she was in Battle Creek, they took me from place to place in the orphan asylum known as Haskell Home. There were their little tables, the children's little tables. There were their little children from 5 years old and upward. They were being educated on how to work and manage. How to work. Notice it's not academic. they had a great pile of sand of a proper quality, and they were teaching the children how to work together, how to make Noah's Ark, and how to make the animals that enter into Noah's Ark. They were all doing this kind of work. So you could call this an Adventist daycare. This is a place, a preschool, or whatever you want to call it. Sand piles, learning how to work, how to manage, how to have order, discipline, and obedience. And now we've seen on the board here how the homeschools are performing. How are these Adventist schools performing? You know, regardless of what they're doing with the early kids today, you know, I might counsel, well, it's not me, I might point to the council and say, we got to ask ourselves some questions about what we're doing with our kindergartners, first graders, second graders, these younger age kids, in terms of, are we pushing the schoolroom and the academics, or are we getting them outdoors, are we getting them in piles of sand, and all of these kinds of things. But done with that, let's ask ourselves now the question, how are our schools doing? The good news is they are outperforming the public schools. And these are schools who, by and large, aren't following the blueprint to a T. I don't want to just throw stones and be critical, but you know, that's reality. But even then, they're doing way better. So this study was called the Cognitive Genesis Study. This is where they looked at 800 Seventh-day Adventist schools, over 51,000 students. This is an enormous 4-year study where they tested the child's ability, and then they tested the child's achievement, and they wanted to identify the quality of the education. You see, what is his ability, and then how does he achieve, and then, just in other words, how did the school help him outperform himself, if you will. And here's the results. After 3 years of Adventist education, achievement outpaced ability in every grade level in the study. Now, people have often said, well, of course Christian schools do better than public schools on the tests because Christian school families have higher socioeconomic status, they care more about their kids' education, so they're putting them in private schools, and of course they're coming from better families, therefore the kids will do better. Did you see what happened in the study there? Their achievement outpaced their ability. So this is comparing themselves with themselves. Also, when you look at the average first enrollment of a Seventh-day Adventist student, they come in at the 52nd percentile of ability. So in other words, they're about average. They're not ultra super gifted coming from these amazing homes where they've had this incredible upbringing. No, 52nd percentile of ability when they come into Seventh-day Adventist education. The Seventh-day Adventist Church is very diverse. It's a broad spectrum of socioeconomic, demographic, very international, a lot of multicultural settings. And so this isn't like your, you know, advantaged, upper middle class, you know, Christian school that you may have seen in the past, you know, gated communities and so on, and these children, you know, it's nothing like that, 52nd percentile. But after 7 years of Adventist education, the average child has increased their achievement to 69th percentile nationally. So 52nd percentile ability when they begin school, 7 years in Seventh-day Adventist schools puts them at the 69th percentile. So it's the education that's producing that achievement. The schools are producing that achievement. It makes them more than 2/3. 67% would be 2/3. So more than the 67th percentile. That's pretty significant right there. So here it is on a graph. You see a similar finding here. In red, you have ability. So ability and achievement at the same par at the beginning. Ability rises over time, but notice achievement rises even more. So after 7 years, you can see the achievement of students outpacing ability, which is a pretty exciting thing to see. And you might say, well, how is their ability rising? Well, as their achievement rises, their ability follows too. So they're going up together over time. So that's a very positive thing. But also, you might ask why? Why is this working? This must mean that the way our Seventh-day Adventist schools are functioning is A-OK. No, it doesn't, because when you look at how many of them are functioning and you compare it with the blueprint, there's a disconnect there. You're going to see that in sessions 3 and 4. Don't take my word for it. Don't be a critical stone thrower, but let's also be realistic. The reason that success is happening is, I watched this video about Seventh-day Adventist education, and basically the claim was made that Seventh-day Adventist schools are succeeding because they're following the blueprint, because we have a wonderful blueprint about education. And I'm going, you know, that I respect the film and the idea of promoting Christian school. That's great. But homeschoolers, they're doing 84th, 86th percentile stuff. And they're not even following the blueprint either. I mean, if you followed the actual blueprint, you'd see academic success through the roof. And by the way, I'm talking a lot about academics right now, but remember what we talked about last session is about 100,000 times more important than what we're talking about with academics. Training the youth to be that last army of gospel workers who will present that message. And the spiritual stuff is way more important. But a lot of people are asking the question, if I send my kid to a Seventh-day Adventist school, then they're not going to succeed academically because they don't have all of the science labs and big programs and, giant tech facilities and giant libraries. And, they look at all of the facilities that are offered by some of these massive public schools and they say, compare that with a small Christian school. Well, you know what? The smallness of the Christian school is actually one of its greatest advantages. Within the Adventist schools, the smallest ones, the small ones I should say, as compared to the large ones, on average did better academically. They brought better academic performance out of their students than the large ones. They all did well relative to public schools, but interestingly there was an advantage to smallness. So don't look at the public schools and just be in awe over the facilities and say this is such a great thing academically. Remember, the 21st century is changing everything about education. What we used to view as something awe-inspiring in education is no longer the case. You know what's beneficial to kids, spiritually, academically, and everything? A teacher who gets to know them, who cares about them, who prays with them, a small community of children, even if they're not following the blueprint perfectly, even if there's some Laodicean and mixed multitude elements in there, the Spirit of God is striving and working in a way that blows the public school out of the water with its worldly, secular, humanist, just postmodern mindlessness. And this is just a beautiful gem compared to that. So I want to prop up and promote Seventh-day Adventist schools and seek to reform them and promote homeschooling all at the same time. And here's where I want to end this session. Everywhere I go, as I travel around, I hear more and more and more that our schools are closing, our schools are losing enrollment. And I absolutely celebrate the rise of homeschooling, but I literally weep over the fact that Adventist schools, Adventist kids are being sent to public schools, and our schools are closing down. Tuition is expensive, and this academic advantage, might not look like enough to parents to say, I'm going to shell out this amount of tuition. So I think that when we just promote the academic advantage that our schools offer, it's not enough of a pitch to convince worldly-minded, Laodicean-minded families, honestly, that they want to send their kids to the Adventist school. And so we're struggling. Lots of our schools are struggling. Cognitive Genesis, this study has been out for a couple of years, and our enrollment is still declining and struggling in many sectors. So what is the solution? Yes, make the case for the academic success, because that is important. But more importantly than that, to truly have a revival of Adventist schools, here's the statement I want to close with. God will bless those schools that are conducted according to His design. And that's what we're going to turn to next. What is the design? What is the blueprint? And how can we reform our schools to make them as home-like as possible and to make them according to God's program? We're going to see just a whole host of features, of descriptors, of different qualifications to make our schools what God has called them to be. It's not just that they need to be home-like. That's huge. I want to hit that point again and again. But you're going to see incredible things. I'm not going to say any of it right now. Watch 3 and 4, sessions 3 and 4 of Undoctrinated. And this message right here is important because what we've seen is this story, as it's traversed throughout history, is culminating in the homeschool movement and what I believe is a reform and a revival of true education. I visited places like Heartland College, like Ouachita Hills. I talked about Red Bluff, many places where they really are doing true education. And this along with the homeschool movement, will produce the last generation.
The purpose of education is not to fit me to get a good job and make money and be successful. The purpose of education is to restore me into the image of my Maker, Jesus.
Ouachita Hills provides an education that is more holistic. We don't only focus on the academics, we also focus on the physical development of the students, we focus on the spiritual development of the students, as well as the social development.
Some people will say, but I'm not going to support myself doing carpentry. Why should I spend time learning that when I could be learning chemistry and physics and biology better? The truth is, most students do not support themselves after they graduate with the vocational skills they learned while in high school. But many do use those skills to work their way through college. But I believe there's more to why God encouraged His people to have that kind of program than simply being able to use them to support yourself. You see, working part of the day and studying part of the day helps the mind to be able to connect and concentrate and focus better when there is the time for studying.
If we look in the Bible right back to the beginning at Genesis, you know, He created man and woman, and what did He do? He put them in the garden to tend to the garden.
It is the ABC of education. It develops the physical, the mental, and the spiritual. The physical aspects, when you're working outside agriculture, you get those benefits. The mental is when you're working in agriculture, in that area, you have to be very careful in things that you do. And the spiritual aspects, when you come in contact with nature, you come in contact with the Creator as well.
When I first came into the kitchen, I had no clue what I was doing. I put a pot on the stove and I looked at Chef and I was like, okay, what am I supposed to do with this? And you know, now I am cooking all sorts of different things. I've made granola, I've made sausage patties, I've made all types of random things. And it's just a lot of fun.
We're learning to make clothes out of scratch. So we go into town and we buy our own fabric, pick it out.
I really didn't know anything about sewing. I had never used a sewing machine or any of that sort. But coming here, I learned the different settings of a sewing machine, how to change the settings.
I've only been in sewing for like 4 weeks, but I've actually learned a lot about the machine, its components, how it works, how to buy fabric, how to tell, you know, whether fabric is like good quality or bad quality.
Usually at an auto shop, a teenager, like somewhere else, they'll be sweeping up, cleaning up, things like that, not really doing anything. But here I've had a lot of opportunities to do a lot of stuff. I've changed water pumps, thermostats, power steering pumps, different stuff like that.
We work hand in hand right next to them as they're working, and we can be doing anything from digging a ditch for installing a new water line for the greenhouse for the agriculture department, or we could be working on putting siding on a house. We can be working at pouring a cement slab for a bicycle rack.
Before I'd gotten here, I had not worked a day in my life, and I didn't even know what work was. But all the skills that they've taught me and the long hours I've worked have helped condition me to meet real-world aspects when it comes to work.
The biggest thing that I've seen that God is helping me to be able to grow in is to be able to see how it can be more useful. It also gives you purpose and direction and sense of being able to be important to, you know, everybody that's around you, so that you can continue and work for others, and it becomes a blessing to help people out in that aspect.
One of the unique things about canvassing is that I've seen is if you ask almost any graduating student from our school, ask them what's been the most impactful part of their experience here at Ouachita Hills, 9 times out of 10 they say it's canvassing.
Ellen White talks about in the book called Porter Ministry that it's the best preparation for pastoral ministry, and how true that is. The canvassing work is the best preparation because you meet people of all different faiths, of all different nationalities and personalities, and you really get to meet with these people.
Our program is set up so that along with the academics, we get a practical application of the witnessing tips that we're learning in class.
I had the opportunity when I first came as a student to Washita Hills College that they put me in the office to work. And I was taking business and they put me in to answering phones, and I did some customer service and sales. And that experience, that was the first year, that taught me a lot in how to deal with people, how to work with staff and students, but also how to deal with people on the outside.
This is my third year working in the business office. I work with Ms. Rebecca, who is the bookkeeper, accountant, but I also work in resources. So I get to do a lot of work that pertains to calling people or receiving phone calls and processing orders, credit cards, things like that.
I do a lot of registrar work, like permission slips that get faxed in or mailed in, I have to file them, or I have to record it on the computer, on Excel and stuff like that.
I've been able to help make a set for video recording, different things, as well as photography for the school, as well as learning Final Cut, which is a videography program we're using, as well as running cameras for the different things, Wednesday night, Friday night. And it's been great learning something I hadn't really done before, but thankfully to the school, I've had a privilege of working in this department, and I plan to learn as much as possible and be able to use it in however way God would want me to later on.
As we look at cognitive development, the Bible says, whatsoever things you do, do all to the glory of God. And so not only are we trying to work in our vocational aspect, but also in the academic area, we want to do it with excellence. So therefore, our program focuses on the mental development, and we want people to not just be reflectors of other men's thoughts. I have a simple way of explaining it. You know, information without demonstration cannot lead to transformation.
There is nothing more calculated to strengthen the mind than the study of God's Word. And so a student who excels at studying God's Word will excel in every other aspect because their mind will grow and expand, and it'll become, they'll become able to become successful, not only in Bible, but in math and English and so forth. And so in every class we try to bring in scriptural principles because the fear of the Lord is the beginning of wisdom.
The focus of our health and life sciences courses is to enable students to explore the natural world and to gain an understanding of the inner world of the human body. Our general studies courses give every student an essential knowledge of the body, as well as practical training in natural remedies. In addition, we offer courses that emphasize skills that are needed for medical missions work. And we're also currently expanding our program to include the first 2 years of allied health, pre-med, and nursing degrees.
We like to emphasize the aspect of music as a powerful tool for sharing Jesus with others. We receive a lot of practical instructions through classes, through music lessons, as well as special speakers such as Scott Ritzema and others. After he spoke here, I really understood how powerful music can be when it's done in God's way.
Ever since coming to Washita Hills, I've learned those right principles of music, and I now know that music can help us to benefit and to bless others, to keep us from discouragement, to help us learn Scripture. And I think music is a very important aspect in spreading the gospel because it does those things for people. And it could do a lot for the kingdom of God if we use it in the right way.
I was just taking business because I liked math, I liked organization, that kind of thing, but it changed the way I thought in the importance of business and its relation to ministry and mission.
Here at Washita Hills, you learn so much of why you get you get not only challenge yourself, but you can also challenge even the teachers. And that really opens up a lot of opportunity to really start discussions and to learn from those discussions. And it leads to a lot of personal interest to even pursue spiritual topics and knowledge outside of class.
We've kind of wanted to take a paradigm shift of the normal classical form of evangelism and just taking the approach that evangelism should be the very DNA of the church.
The principles of true education aren't just limited to the classroom, but they also apply to life in general. And being an education major here at Ouachita Hills has motivated me to strive for excellence in my life, both academic and spiritual excellence, so that I can model that to my future students. As educators, we have the unique privilege of reaching children at the most critical points in their lives. And not only do we get to help them make their decision for Jesus, but we also get to demonstrate what practical Christianity is like in our everyday lives.
I was at an interview one time, and they asked what my favorite subject was, and I told them worship and Bible. And they wanted to know why. And I said, because when the children get to the judgment, God isn't going to ask them if they know their states and capitals or if they know their multiplication tables. He's going to ask, what did you do with Jesus? And that's the main thing we want to teach. However, in this world, they do need to know the states and capitals. They do need to know the multiplication tables and a multitude of other things. So we try to have a balanced education to where the students are learning how to teach Jesus in every area of the curriculum. And I stress it in every area of the curriculum, not just in Bible, not just in worship. God created math too. And of course we study about Him and learn about Him in science class, but in the interaction of people in social studies class, we learn about Jesus. So our focus is twofold, Jesus and the education that is necessary to get along in this world as we prepare for the next one.
If the gospel of Jesus Christ is real and true, and as good as we believe it is, and it is, then it really should impact everything in our lives.
Mission trips are very interesting because we think of them as the student going out to minister to the people in that country and how much they're going to change those people's lives. But in reality, it's two-tiered. The student's life gets changed almost as much or even more than the people that they are ministering unto. And that was my experience there in the Philippines.
The purpose of education is to educate the person, but education assumes what the person is like. In false philosophies, you have body-soul dualism. And so the focus on education is just the salvation of the soul. But we're reminded that we're a complete person, body, soul, spirit, we have a social nature. And so a complete program of education should take into account what a human being is like and should formulate their curriculums accordingly. So you should have curriculum that addresses the mental aspects of the person, the spiritual aspects of the person, the physical aspects of the person, and the social aspects of the person. This is what a true education should accomplish.
Our aim at Ouachita Hills is to help the students understand what is the true purpose of development. The true purpose of development and education is to serve others, not only this life, but for eternity.
True education has shown me the importance of redemption in all points in life. Education today has sadly been limited to just an attainment of knowledge, but it does not have to be so. It should encompass the physical, spiritual, and the mental. Education is not just limited to a four-year college degree. The value of education should be for a lifetime. True education has instilled in me the passion for a life with Jesus and to share that same passion with others. Worldly missions only result in worldly treasures. This heavenly mission produces eternal results. This is the power of true education. Redemption in Christ.